Hello, folks. Welcome back to the program. It's Chris live in central Pennsylvania with my special guest today, Professor William Gumede. Now, Professor Gumede is well known to those who follow political science in South Africa. He is, of course, the founder of the Democracy Works Foundation and author of the best-selling book, Restless Nation, Making Sense of Troubled Times, which is published by Tafelberg, if I'm not mistaken. There's a link to that. If you want to go get that book, you can get it. You probably also get it through exclusive, I would imagine, to get yourself a copy of that book if you haven't got it already. But he wrote an op-ed. He penned it recently, and I thought we should talk about this. He said the ANC is to blame for racism and tribalism in South Africa. And I'm here to dispute that with Professor Gumede. According to what I've read in many media outlets in South Africa, Jan van Riebeck and apartheid and colonialism are responsible exclusively. It's not the ANC. So, Professor Gumede, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you on.
No, thank you for having me. Looking forward to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise. No, so but I've heard it's all Jan's fault. At least that's what it breaks down to here. But this op-ed that you published, this came about as a consequence of what? You've been, of course, I think pointing out the obvious when it comes to the challenges in South African politics for several years now, and I know people listen, but I wish more people would listen.
Yeah, I mean, my frustration really is for the ANC, for the African National Congress, as being South Africa's dominant party since 1994. And although the ANC is now in a coalition with other partners in a government of national unity, the ANC does behave as if it's still a majority party. Its views, it forces its views and its policies, its party views, actually, and party policies. And it is making it as it is the government's policy and so on. And I think, the ANC has been getting away, and not only the ANC, but other African liberation movements in other countries, Zimbabwe, for example, or in Angola and Mozambique. They get away with, they make mistakes. They come up with absolutely stunningly poor policies. If these policies fail, then they blame the past. They blame colonialism, they blame apartheid, or they blame the West for all of the problems, self-inflicted problems. Now, the sad part of all of this is that many of their supporters and voters often give these parties a free pass, gives the ANC a free pass because, the ANC blames the past instead of taking responsibility for its own failings.
Well, I think that's a fair point, and I would argue, as you have argued, that the ANC has scored so many own goals, it's probably difficult to keep a tally. I mean, if this were a FIFA World Cup, it would be, the South Africans 10 million, the ANC 0 at this stage.
Yes, I mean, a couple of years ago, I gave a lecture at a lockdown university, so online university ran out of London. It was set up by South Africans during COVID. And what I did was compare South Africa last 30 years with other emerging markets, our peer markets, and how our peer markets have actually been very, very successful within a 30-year period. Poland, South Korea, Singapore, and even, Saudi Arabia. So 30-year period, because the ANC was the dominant party in the 30-year period. And one of the, major turning point for all of those countries has been just being pragmatic and then focusing on the present and the future and not living in the past and not blaming the past and so on. Focus on the future, focus on the opportunities, and then be practical and pragmatic and strike pragmatic partnerships with the rest of the world also.
Well, I think if we contrast right there in your own neighborhood and some of the very same people, the Tswana people who live in Botswana, if we contrast Botswana's post-independence era from 1966 until 2019, we have to go before COVID because Masisi's presidency was arguably a disaster for Botswana in many ways from a totalitarian perspective and economic perspective. But if we go back before that, a very pragmatic approach was taken by the Botswana, the BDP, the Democratic Party. They, for years, embraced their population, which is, to be fair, predominantly Tswana, but it also includes the Kalanga from Zimbabwe who migrated in there. It also includes the San, and of course, there are a number of European origin Botswana themselves. In fact, their former agriculture minister was an Afrikaner. They've embraced multi-market capitalism. They've embraced honest government. Now, that's not to say there's no corruption, particularly the past several years it's creeped in Botswana. But if we contrast what the ANC has done with what the BDP did for a long time in Botswana, it seems a very different approach, and it worked very well for the folks in Botswana for a long period of time. But now it looks like we've got a different track taking place here with the ANC. It looks like I lost you there for a moment.
You did. I mean, you know, when we look at when the first when the first African country became independent, it's in 1847, and it was Liberia became independent. And there's about 54 African countries. And you look at a record, you know, it's a long record, 1847 to now. Only a few African countries actually have done well. So now we have to ask ourselves the question, why? If you look at Botswana, Mauritius, Cape Verde in recent times, they've done extraordinarily well in, you know, sort of three levels. One, economic prosperity over a long period. Two, democratic stability over an extended period. And last, political stability, society stability. So for me, those are sort of three core things. Now, what they have done, these three countries, they've been more pragmatic, number one. Secondly, they've governed inclusively, not the political party and its leaders governing for themselves. And they have not blamed other people. They've not blamed the past. They said, well, look, you know, the past happened to us. And yes, the past was terrible, but here we are now. We've been given, you know, the cards to play with, and we'll focus on the present and we'll focus on the future, and we will strike pragmatic partnerships with the rest of the world that can help us, and with pragmatic policies. And we look at policies that's actually worked in other places. We're not going to be stuck with ideological policies, with emotional policies, with revenge policies, and so on. And that's why these countries have done better, and they've dealt with corruption effectively, and they've also focused on democracy. So most of these failing African countries, most of them, or their leaders or their governing parties, said, look, you know, democracy is not important. They'll focus on economic development. And those who thought that democracy was not important, I mean, they all failed. Is very, very clear. And that is why it's so heartbreaking. And in South Africa, there are many people who would say, many political leaders say, well, actually, we do not care about democracy. Democracy is some kind of Western concept. Let's just focus on development first. And let's just use authoritarian methods to get to development. Although the history in Africa since 1847, and I want to emphasize 1847, when the first African country became independent, it has been extraordinary. It's just been miserable for African countries that chose not to focus on democracy and not to focus on pragmatic economic policies.
You know, it's interesting that we talk about these other countries in the context of what's happening in South Africa, because the ANC wants to blame the past. We're going to get into that in a moment. But the thing is that if we look at what's happened with the ANC, they have become a party that is focused on their cadres. That's their primary concern. They're arrogant. They're disrespectful. This so-called government of national unity, when it was formed a couple of years ago, I immediately pointed out that the Democratic Alliance, which had a very strong hand, played a very weak hand. It's as if they had all aces and they played deuces instead in this game, because what happened is that the ANC held on to every ministry of any consequence: intelligence, foreign affairs, finance. They have the police, they have the military, all the levers of state power they held on to. The only things that they gave to the DA were things that were broken and desperately needed to be fixed, like home affairs and some of the minor ministries like communications and such. The DA played a very poor hand in this. And from that moment, of course, we go back, Professor Gumede, you saw what was happening here, is that the DA and the ANC reached an agreement. That was a bilateral coalition between the two of them. And then the ANC went behind the DA's back and invited 8 other parties to join it to give this masquerade of government and national unity so they can mollify their voters. That's my view, that, look, it's not us with the DA, it's us with everybody. And what we have here is the ANC with a plurality acting as if they have an outright majority, and they're just doing what they want. They don't consult their partners. They don't listen. In fact, when the Freedom Front Plus made a trip to the United States to find out what the United States wanted from South Africa and then came back, they refused to give Corne Mulder, the president refused to even have a meeting with him, even though he was the number 2 in that political party, now the leader of that party. He said, I'm not going to meet with you, even though he was bringing stuff back to talk to the president. I think the arrogance is one of the major downfalls of the ANC.
No, absolutely. And the ANC is a typical African liberation movement. Has it has a very less skewed view of democracy. The idea, the ANC's philosophy of democracy is one where a majority party rule, the majority rule. And that really is a very, very narrow view of democracy. And when it put together the GNU, essentially, the way it looked at it was just as, bringing other parties as an add-on, not as a genuine coalition. Because in a genuine coalition, parties come together and then they decide on the sort of core policies that they're going to implement. And then they also then decide on, how they're going to distribute a fairly, let's say, cabinet positions. But what the ANC has done essentially is just to bring on the DA and other members of the GNU to help them actually stay in power, so to speak. And that's the challenge. If you're in a coalition, if a political party is in a coalition with a African liberation movement, the challenge then is, how do you partner with a party that actually does not really believe in full, true democracy? And when I say true democracy, meaning, true partnership with other parties. And a true partnership is to say, let's have a policies that is in a country interest, not in the party interest or in the party leaders' interest. And that really is a challenge. So, the DA has been forced, and also, of course, the Freedom Front Plus and the Inkatha Freedom Party, that's part of the GNU, they've been forced to be partners and also opposition parties within the GNU, because the ANC does not allow a genuine partnership.
Well, I think that's a key point here, is that this has never been a partnership. They act as if they still have a 2/3 majority, which they briefly had once upon a time for one election cycle. And they just make decisions without consulting anyone else. It's very frustrating. If we go back to the apartheid era, Professor Gumede, the two big pillars that the security state relied upon from the 70s, from the Soweto riots onwards, I would argue, were the two things they tried to frighten the white minority with. And that, of course, was the Swart Gevaar and the Rooi Gevaar, the red menace and the black menace. And of course, the red menace being communism, which there was some legitimacy to that argument. But the black menace being that black Africans can't govern themselves, and taking a paternalistic aspect or view towards it. But right on their doorstep, Botswana proved that to be a false argument, that black Africans can in fact rule themselves and they're just as capable as anybody else. But unfortunately, what we see happening here at a rather, primary school level of analysis is that a lot of people are saying, look at the ANC, see, blacks can't govern. And that's not the lesson we should learn from this, because that's not true. What we should learn from this is that crooks can't govern. People who are dishonest can't govern. Would you agree with or disagree with my argument?
No, absolutely. I agree with your argument fully. I mean, the thing is, when the ANC says, you're talking about Swart Gevaar, the ANC now has a white Gevaar, or Wit Gevaar, where it scares its voters to say, well, actually, if you not continue to support us, the whites are going to come back and they're going to bring in apartheid. That is so absolutely ridiculous. That's just not possible. As a country, we've moved on. So the issue really is that the ANC, as a liberation movement, they may have been effective as a liberation movement, but as a governing party, they've been stunningly ineffective. Now, the thing is, the success that makes for or the ingredients that make for a successful liberation movement is not an ingredient that makes for a successful governing of a state and building a democracy. In a liberation movement, and particularly a violent liberation movement, the people that normally rise to the top and the talents that are appreciated are those people who shout the loudest, those people who attack the enemy the loudest. And the liberation movement also don't need policies, because all you need to do is to say, well, you're against something. That's all. So, but once you get into power, and you run a sophisticated state like South Africa, you now need to have people with competencies, people who've run something in their lives before, and you now have to look at real life policies and so on. But if you have the same sort of people still in charge that were there only because they shouted the loudest, which really propels you in a liberation movement. If you say you are a revolutionary, or you radical, or you can dance like a Jacob Zuma, for example, that propels you to the leadership of the party. Now you have to govern a state where you now really, in charge of a sophisticated engineering company like Eskom, for example, and these sophisticated skills and management skills. You don't have that. And then also, with the ANC and many other of these liberation movements, they are arrogant, so they don't admit that they need the skills of the wider country, and the skills of even non-South Africans, outsiders, also other countries to partner with. And that has been a downfall of the ANC.
Well, I'd have to agree with that 100%. It's certainly been the case. They certainly behave in a fashion that is contrary. And the point you make, it's almost universal. There are a few exceptions to liberation movements that successfully transition to governing coalitions or governing governments. It rarely happens because the skill set is not identical. In 1994, Professor Gumede, as a young officer captain in Germany, when the elections took place in April of 1994, people asked me, because they knew that I followed Africa, and my eventual career goal was to become a regional specialist for Africa, which worked out very well. But at the time, they asked me, said, so what's going to happen in South Africa? I said, well, South Africans are going to have to be patient. They're going to have to be patient because, number one, the police have to be transformed into an organ that protects the white minority, into one that does community policing, ensures that everybody is safe, and ensures that people can conduct their business and have commerce. I said that's the first thing. Second thing is that a lot of these ANC leaders, their response to apartheid was not to go to school, or to go off into the bush and go abroad into Angola or somewhere like that and be part of MK. And so they have very poor education, formal education, and they're not going to know how to run bureaucracies, and they have to be patient. So it's going to take a couple generations. Now, there are exceptions, the Thabo Mbeki's who went off to Oxford and places like that, which should have given the ANC a head start. They should have enough technocrats, and they did early on, but they abandoned those folks later on for the most part. But my argument is that back then was that they're going to have to be patient because, in my view, it's going to take a couple generations of fixing education so that everyone gets a fair opportunity at education, where those people begin to enter the workforce. 20 to 30 years for South Africa to make significant progress, but it can make it, but the country has to be patient. But instead we get, equity stakes handed out to the connected elites, and instead of real economic change, we get these educational outcomes where lots of money spent in education, but the outcomes are far worse than under apartheid, arguably. And we've gone backwards in so many ways. But my argument was it's going to take 2 generations, and a generation in my mind being a decade of kids coming up, 2 generations before we see real substantive progress. And instead, we've gone backwards.
No, we've gone backwards. I mean, again, if you look at our peers in the 30 years that we've now been post-apartheid era, if you look at it, it's a wonderful 30-year period because also other emerging markets in 30-year periods have done very, very well. So Singapore, Poland, more recently, and so on. We've gone backwards. Now, I think there's been a couple of policies that the ANC followed. One is the ANC's policies of cadre deployment. That essentially means that the ANC takes its members and then it appoints its members in all parts of the state. But it may have worked if it appointed competent people to the state. Now, it didn't, so it's appointed mostly people with political experience, based on their political and their sort of anti-apartheid experience, rather than on their competence to run sophisticated state institutions and state companies that have led to the total collapse of the state, of big parts of the state. The second part was that the ANC, in a good way said, well, actually, we need a black middle class and we need a black business people. Okay, that's all good because that's that's what we need. Then they decided, well, actually, to do that, again, they need to appoint their politicians who've never run a business, or any, even a spice shop, and so on. And they're now going to become political capitalists. And they're going to get shares in white companies, as part of Black economic empowerment. But also a second part of Black economic empowerment that people often don't think of is they're now going to get contracts from the state. Because, the South African state actually is a state that delivers mostly through contracts. You get a contract from the state and you deliver service. You fill a pothole and so on. And the South African state has annually now in recent times, the last couple of years, has a 1 trillion rand procurement budget every year. And and in that procurement budget, for the last couple of years, or since 2000, it is compulsory to have some kind of BE credentials to get a contract in the state. Now, think about it. 1 trillion rand a year, to deliver services. So what the ANC then did was also to deploy its political cadres to set up companies to deliver for the state. And often companies have been set up specifically to get a government contract, and either they often never delivered or they inflate prices and so on. So what it meant is it has caused a lack of delivery, basic education, health, other kinds of contracts in the state. So we've had like almost a dual failure because of this policy of deployment of ANC cadres to the public service, caused the public service to fail and not to deliver services. But then also state contracts because through the policy of BE also did not deliver. Then also in the private sector, in the private sector, the BE in the private sector then enriched a few ANC-connected political leaders, and that meant that money in the private sector was actually lost. That it could have been used for development. It could have been used for small business development. It could have been used to fix education and so on. But now it went to ANC politicians who became BE entrepreneurs.
Well, in fact, we can look at the mess that goes on and on and on. For instance, we had the famous case of a BE tender for a company that was fictitious for textbooks for poor school children in the Eastern Cape. The books never delivered years later. We also have the sports ground there in the Eastern Cape that was spent, 30 million or 60 million rand to build a sports ground. And I mean, all I need to do is get a lawnmower and go out and put a piece of, chalk out there, and I would have had a better product than that. And we can go on to the Tembisa scandal, in which Babita Deokaran was assassinated over for simply pointing out the corruption there. And she paid with her life, sadly. And of course, we're still waiting for the Charlotte Mackeksa Hospital to be repaired years after it was burned down. And this is all because these contracts are given to people who are connected, and oftentimes, as you said, they don't have the capacity to actually do it. They're just fictitious, or even if they are, they have inflated prices because there's no competition. And instead of getting an efficient government, you get a bloated government, and you get so much graft and corruption. I mean, Professor Gumede, we could just sit here for an hour and go through the arms scandal, Oilgate, Travelgate, the Vereda Dairy Farm scandal, the asbestos tender in the Free State, Zandile Gumede's 178 charges of corruption, the PPE scandals. I mean, every day I turn around, there are more stories in the media about more theft and more corruption. And then the murder of Armand Swart, this poor innocent young guy, a father in his 20s walking around doing his job, and they mistakenly thought he was a whistleblower, so they shot him like 26 times and murdered him. He had nothing to do with it. It's, in many ways, it seems like gangsters are running the country at this stage. I don't mean to embellish or be flamboyant or hysterical, but I mean, in the construction industry, in the taxi industry, these things are run by gangsters.
Yeah. No. So if we just reduce corruption in this country, in itself will give us economic growth. I mean, if we reduce corruption by, let's say, between 10 and 20% every year, I mean, and that's very, very conservatively, we won't need anything. We don't need to increase taxes. We don't need anything else, and so on. So, I mean, just if you look at it, blaming the past for the problems right now, given the fact that, all of the money that's been lost in corruption and incompetence, in misplaced BE, and so on. I mean, it absolutely does not make sense at all. if we would, I mean, the BE money that went to a few individuals, that money has gone into development. The corruption that we lose every year in the states, in state-owned entities, the waste, just the incompetence, the money that we lost through incompetence. I mean, if we just can stop the leaks, this country will absolutely prosper.
Well, that's what's so frustrating for me, Professor Gumede. South Africa has the human capital, it has the mineral wealth, it has the agricultural potential, even though only 13% of the land is arable. Nonetheless, that 13% is very productive. It had a wealth of very well-equipped universities with great graduates. It turned out it had a great history of scientific discoveries, and we just have such a mess here that really needs to be cleaned up. But here's the thing. The question is, how do we get out of it? You mentioned in your op-ed the Mhlanga Commission and the Zondo Commission exposing the rot that's taking place in currently the Mhlanga Commission with all these high-level police. Almost all of them are being exposed for corruption, which doesn't surprise me, but it's still eye-opening to the world. And you talk about how this has undermined the credibility of the party. And here's a sentence at the end of one of your paragraphs. It says, it has also discredited the ANC as an honest broker for inclusive nation building, and talking about advancing progressive issues or transformation. I think the ANC is discredited as trying to build a nation. Also, I mean, it's difficult to talk about building a nation when we have a cover-up at Pala Pala. There's kidnapping and torture allegations and collusion with Namibian police forces. And all that aside, somebody has to answer for $580,000 illegally brought into the country, not declared to customs or to immigration, and so that whole scandal, which was covered up by SAPS, by the VIP Protection Unit, which falsely claimed in their annual report that not a single of the 43 VIP residences had any break-ins or any incidents. That was a lie, and that's a matter of public record. And then, of course, whatever Arthur Fraser's claims, outlandish or otherwise, Ramaphosa's admitted $580,000 was stuffed in a sofa. It arrived on Christmas Day, and it was the end of February when it was stolen. Aren't there any banks open after Christmas? I know New Year's is kind of a business holiday, bank holiday, but, you got all of January and all of February to put that stuff in the bank. I mean, when it comes to credibility, I think the ANC's lost completely, and the rot starts at the top.
No, absolutely. For transformation to happen, you need a credible political party, and you need honesty. If you don't have honesty, because these are difficult reforms that we need in the country. We need, fixing the economy, helping previously disadvantaged communities, and so on. A party that governs that does that and oversees that needs to have the credibility, and you don't have the credibility unless you're honest, and unless significant numbers of people see you as honest. If you're not seen as honest, I mean, you might as well exit the political arena, exit the government, and allow others to take charge. And and I think often ANC members and supporters possibly often do not understand how policy implementation works. Policy implementation it's not done by decree. You can't say, well, here's our policy, we're going to implement it. It doesn't come by decree. You need your stakeholders to be part of the implementation. And the moment people see you as you don't have the credibility, you're corrupt, you're only looking after yourself as the government, there is no incentive for anyone to help along implementation or to work with the government to implement if they know, well, it's a corrupt government. And their money is just going to be wasted, their time is going to be wasted, their energy is going to be wasted. And I think this is now what's happening with the ANC. So although the ANC is still in government, still running the government, it doesn't have the credibility or the authority to get, to get its reforms across to society.
Well, there's a lot of problems, and we could probably spend 3 days sitting here discussing this, and we both have other things to do at some point. But I do want to make this suggestion and get your thoughts on it. the black, white, and brown South Africans living in London, living in Japan, in France, in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, to a lesser degree in the United States, the expats living abroad, many of these are very successful, very talented people with advanced degrees or business acumen and experience. If South Africa got its act together, I strongly suspect, because I know many of these people, there would be a significant return of expats back to South Africa because they love their home, whether they're black, whether it's Swana or they're Swati or they're Venda or they're Afrikaner or Portuguese. It doesn't matter. They love South Africa, and with good reason, and they would want to come back and be part of the change. Unlike Liberia, where the Liberians don't leave America, they want to sit here and bitch and moan about Liberia and get us to give money to Liberia, but they don't want to go back and fix it. I did more to fix Liberia than the Liberians do, but South Africans want to go back, and it would be, I think, such a great boost for those folks to come back. Any thoughts on that? Do you agree or disagree?
No, I agree with you. I mean, firstly, just the sad part that we would, that our country has been so poorly run that people have to leave. Talented people with the energy, with the capability, with the money, with the will, want to make a change in the country. I mean, they love this country. They're great patriots. But the ANC, through its deployment strategy, where it only appoints its own people in government, in state-owned entities, and even in licensing, if you want to get a mineral license or exploration license, if you're not connected to the ANC, you're not going to get that license, right? And even on, public institutions, if you want to be appointed to the board or as an executive of a public institution, if you're not connected to the ANC, sorry, you're not going to get go anywhere, and so on. I mean, that has forced talented South Africans to go abroad, and not only do they take their income with, but they take their skill set with, they take their social capital with, they take the entrepreneurship with them, and they take, maybe for me also as important, their energy with, and the people who leave are actually the most productive people that you don't want them to leave. You want them to be in South Africa. And I think once we get a proper government, an honest government, a competent government, and also an inclusive government, because South Africa is one of the world's most diverse societies. One group, there's some people who wrongly believe that if their group, will be in charge, whether it's their political faction or their race faction or their color faction, they're in charge of the country, they only appoint their people, they'll magically turn the country around. No, that's never going to happen. The only way we're going to get the economic growth, the peace, the prosperity is if we run this country inclusively, that all of the communities are part of Project South Africa, of Project Turnaround South Africa. So I think if we in 2029 can get a coalition government that is inclusive, we will get many South Africans back. And not only will we get many South Africans back, but we will also get other people who want to live in South Africa with the skills, with the money, with the capacity, who will be drawn to South Africa. And I think that is what all of us should try to work on it. How do we get, by the 2029, a centrist government, a centrist coalition that brings together constitutionally minded South Africans, racially inclusive people that believe in the Project South Africa that's diverse and racially inclusive, people who are pro entrepreneurship, who believes in individual entrepreneurship, private entrepreneurship, and also state entrepreneurship, and people who believe in pragmatism, not in people being stuck in ideological, outdated ideologies or single bullet solutions for the whole of the country, and so on. I think if we can somehow pull off in 2029 such a coalition which puts aside the populists like your Umkhonto we Sizwe party, the economic freedom fighters, the populists in the ANC, we can get them out of the way and build a new kind of coalition in 2029, a coalition that is inclusive and it can bring us the stability and the prosperity. It will really turn around the country.
Well, I think, Professor Gumede, if the municipal elections go the way I think they're going to go, where the ANC is going to be punished heavily, and smaller parties gain seats in councils and can rule in a coalition that delivers services at the local level, they will make the argument that I made in 2021 that governance is local. All politics is local. And if you get, especially in South Africa, where unlike here, I mean, my rubbish is picked up by a private company. I pay them. My electricity is a private company. I pay them. The only thing that the state does around here is provide law enforcement. Even my volunteer fire departments volunteer. It's not even the state. So they provide law enforcement, and they are supposed to fix the roads and enforce the laws. That's about all they do for me here. The rest is all private sector. But in South Africa, your rubbish removal, your water, your electricity, your public safety, all of that is done by the government, and it's all done at the local level. And that's where you see the rubber hitting the road. If people get into government, the argument I made in 2021, and they get a coalition or get an outright majority, which is difficult to achieve in most places, they can show that they're honest, they're working hard, they're trying to improve it. And then when it comes to the national election, you go, hey, look at the success we've had. We've delivered. We can do it on a national scale. But I am concerned that South Africans will do what they always do and not show up for the municipal elections. You know, we had just 31% show up of the eligible voters in the last municipal election in 2021, which ironically is great for small parties if they're clever. I mean, if only 100 people vote, then you only need 51 votes to be in charge. But if 5,000 people vote, you need 2,501. You know what I'm saying? But I think people don't get that. But I urge and I beg South Africans to go out and vote. They didn't in 2021. And then when I was actually in South Africa, Western Cape, covering the election in 2024. And I went to 14 polling stations, including 5 in Khayelitsha and Monneberg, Tableview, Rondebosch, all over the place. And I have to say that it was an exciting day, and it was interesting to see the ANC get snubbed like they did. But what have we got? We've got the ANC still ruling as if they're in charge.
I mean, the ANC is still ruling because people are not voting. Even at the national elections, I mean, we've got very low turnouts to elections, which means if you don't pitch up for the election, it allows parties like the ANC to return to power and then govern arrogantly. ANC is not governing in the interest of ordinary people. ANC is governing in the interest of itself, of its political party leaders, and so on. So there is a great opportunity now at a local level, but people must turn up to vote. But also, secondly, we have to get a sizable number of voters that vote based on the present, not based on the past. When I say that, what do I mean by the present? Based on competency. And it's going to be very, very important. South Africa's, we're only going to get the economic dividends and even the democracy dividends if people begin to focus on, not focus on color or focus on race and the past, but they focus on looking at somebody's competence, say, well, and honesty, say, well, I may differ. We may not have the same color of, let's just say, political party leader, but this person is competent, this person is honest, this person has run some kind of entity or managed some kind of thing outside politics and so on. I'll vote for the person. So if we can vote beyond color and vote for competence, this country will be turned around very, very quickly.
Well, that's the argument I made, Professor Gumede. I've said if someone made me dictator for South Africa, I would do it for a couple of years, and I could turn the country around in 6 months. We would already see a positive trajectory because the first thing I would eliminate is BEE. The second thing I would do is clean up the police with actual proper training and investment and money going. Then all the money that's being pilfered now could be diverted towards education and police and public safety, and that would change things. It would take time to get to where we need to be, but the positive trajectory would occur overnight. But let me shift gears a little bit here that's related to what you just said. In 2021, when I started doing this after I retired from active military service, it was a kind of a side thing. I didn't intend to do this broadcasting interviews, but the COVID came around. And so when I tried to encourage people to go out and vote in 2021, I got a lot of pushback from white South Africans in particular. Oh, well, blacks will always vote for the ANC. I said, that's a very bigoted assessment. In fact, in some people's case, it was bordering on racist. But I said you can't consider black South Africans as a monolithic group. Number one, we've got dozens of ethnic groups, and people align for different reasons along ethnic groups or align language, along skin color, lots of reasons. But But the reality is this, and I'm no cheerleader for the Democratic Alliance, but over 20% of their voters are black South Africans, which is completely ignored. It's always called a white party, even though the majority of its voters, or the plurality of its voters, are actually colored, then come white, then come black voters, and Indians in distant because they're so much smaller. But the point is that black South Africans are not monolithic, and you and many people I know in South Africa who are not part of a monolithic bloc. Look, I don't know who you vote for, and I'm not going to ask. That's your position, but I seriously doubt you're an MK or ANC voter. So, for instance, you're a person that can walk and chew gum at the same time, and there are many black South Africans who walk and chew gum. One of the arguments I made to Peter Groenewald, whom I know personally, and I've interviewed many times, and been with him in South Africa many times, is that his party should reach out to non-traditional elements, because people need to get beyond the vision of the Freedom Front Plus or what it was at Constantine Fillon, because that's a different party than it is today. It is arguably the most, or the only genuine, other than the ACDP, I would say, the only genuine conservative party in South Africa, but it's not a right-wing party. If you look at their manifesto, it's all things that most South Africans believe in. I mean, arguably, I would say, Professor Gumede, that most South Africans I've ever met are conservative in their values. They believe in faith, they believe in family, and they believe, in a better outcome for their kids. And I'm not shilling for the Freedom Front Plus. I'm just trying to make the point here that people need to detach themselves from skin color and their tribal affiliation, whether it's Afrikaner or Tswana or Xhosa, and they need to look at what people can deliver for them, because that's how it's going to change things. And for white South Africans not to vote because they're apathetic, or for coloreds not to vote because they're apathetic, or for them to assume that the ANC will stay in power because blacks will always vote for the ANC, that is a juvenile coffee table analysis in my book, and it misses the heart of what's happening in South Africa. Do you disagree, or agree with any of that?
I agree with you in terms of, for people to argue to say blacks are a monolithic group. Of course, your black populace would love to, you love that to be the case, for all blacks just to agree. And that is why there's, as the ANC fail and many other of the populist black parties, as they struggle, they try to bring in the sort of race card to say, well, it must be black solidarity, blacks must only vote for black parties and so on. I mean, that is absolutely crazy, because that is a reason why many African countries have failed. Once you try to bring people in ethnic lagers to vote for you, that's chaos. That's immediate failure, because, you undermine accountability. You give people a free pass because they're black. You say, I'm a black leader, I'll be corrupt, I'll steal all the state's money, but you must vote for me because I'm black. I mean, that was Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma built a 280 million house. I mean, just think about 280 million house with state money, and say, well, you have to vote for me because I'm black, or because I'm Zulu. So if you is a Zulu speaker, you must vote for me. I mean, it is absolutely, it's ridiculous to think of it. I think actually what we need to build is a centrist project in a country that goes across race. And that is, and with, family values, pro-constitution, believe in democracy, and believe in some kind of merit. Of course, we can never have a perfect merit. Even if one do within affirmative action, there would be a merit within it. You get the best people to do a job. And so on. So I think we can put a coalition like that together. I think the country now needs a coalition like that. I mean, we had the ANC as a dominant party for the last 30 years, and now it's a dominant party in the GNU. But I think it is about time now that we have a coalition that excludes the ANC. A different coalition, and a centrist coalition that goes, across race. And I think that must be the ambition of every person who loves South Africa, must try to do that, and to try to get voters out, and because I think the base, the fundamental base, the fundamental heart, the fundamental soul of South Africa is actually at the center. People who believe in the rule of law, who believe in, responsible behaviors individually and collectively, and who believe, together we're better off than separately. And who believe that, some kind of entrepreneurship is important for our country, individual entrepreneurship, and also entrepreneurship in the state. And I think that should be the ambition of everyone, whether you're a business person or whether you don't believe in politics or are not interested in politics, that should actually be all of our ambitions as citizens in South Africa.
You know, Professor Gumede, interesting thing for me about all this is that, first off, I'm adamantly opposed to BEE. I think it's racist in my view. I think giving people artificial advantage is unfair. People know my position on that. But even if I were to accept the concept that BEE is necessary because history, the hypocrisy in the program is just epic. Starlink, of course, has not applied for a license, although Elon Musk keeps saying he can't get a license. Well, he hasn't even applied because he knows he won't get it. But they've offered, an employment equity investment program option. They said, we'll put Starlink in all these schools. And the ANC is not doing it because they want their 30% cut to give to a cater. But here's the thing. Quietly, Amazon Web Services, Amazon, of course, is in the country. Amazon has invested only $20 million US into South Africa. And that money is reserved for black IT companies, 20 million. So Amazon is in South Africa for a song. Starlink was offering to spend far more money delivering services to the actual South Africans in need, not caters. But because it's not for caters, they're not going to let Starlink in. The hypocrisy of this, the outright theft and privilege and arrogance. I think this is a perfect example, which I've seen no one in the media talk about this. And trust me, I'll be making an analysis video of this soon, is that how Amazon can get in the country for just $20 million and they're doing business and nobody complains about their employment equity investment program, but Starlink can't have one. They have to give up 30% of their equity. I mean, that's just, in my mind, brain dead, and it shows the true hypocrisy of what happens when programs like this are abused.
No, absolutely. I mean, the BE program has just been an enrichment scheme. Sort of legalized enrichment scheme. I believe in what we need to do. I do believe that we need some kind of transformation reforms. But what we need to do is we need to give companies, foreign companies, the alternatives to do alternatives. And we need to say, well, actually, what is more important for us? We need investment. We need jobs. And I would say if a company comes in here and bring investment into the country, that we should actually exempt that company from BE, and we say, well, if you bring in investment, that is BE. If you create jobs, that's BE, and so on. So keep it simple. We have to decide. We have to be pragmatic and say, well, South Africa is facing an economic crisis. We've had BE for the last couple of decades. It's only enriched a few people. And so on. We are going to have to review it. And what we now need to do to go forward is to say, well, we need new investment. We need new local investment. We need foreign investment. And if you come to South Africa and you invest, well, that investment is actually black economic empowerment. That's how we should argue.
So while we're talking about the government national unity here, the Democratic Alliance entered this agreement with the ANC, and the argument they made was to keep MK and EFF out of government. I argue that's a red herring. And as long as Ramaphosa is in charge of the ANC, the EFF will never be part of a coalition at the national level because he can't stand Malema, and that's never going to happen. And the ANC would never go into coalition except out of utter desperation with MK because the MK will eat it from within. This is in large measure big chunks of the radical economic transformation portion of the ANC that became part of the MK. And so I think that the DA, that was a misleading statement, but that was their claim. But since they've joined it, and this is the question I want to ask you, if you think that the DA has lost some credibility with its voters because they are now part of a government that is implementing the Employment Equity Act amendment, which limits the number of white men in senior management positions, mid-level management, for private corporations to just 4%. And then also we have this insane violation of the Constitution, the Expropriation Without Compensation Act, which violates Section 25 of the Constitution. Then, of course, national health insurance is really, in my view, a communist takeover of the private sector, and it's not going to deliver health for anyone. And then, of course, the one that I find most ironic, for a country in which students protested against the imposition of a colonial language of Afrikaans in 1976 and 1985, to have the ANC impose the English colonial language upon South Africans, only 6% of whom speak it as a first language, and they go to primary school, they have to speak English. I think that's the most ironic of all these pieces of legislation because, seriously, so your child is Venda and doesn't speak English and goes to primary school and now has to be taught the day they arrive. Look, kids are flexible and they can learn, but there's a learning curve and they're at a disadvantage. They should learn in their first language and then learn the second language at school. But anyway, but all of these things are coming to fruition during the time that the DA is part of the government national unity. And publicly, there's been very little pushback from them on lines in the sand that they clearly articulate as an opposition party. Have they lost credibility with their voters? And if so, have they gained it with other voters who now think that, hey, we like the DA?
I don't think the DA has necessarily lost credibility because, as I say, the challenge of being in a partnership with a party like the ANC, that's not democratic and doesn't believe in this, in the broad-based constitutional values. Yes, this is in charge of a democracy, but not really in, its belief system and its political culture is a very narrow look at a way of looking at democracy, and the ANC still insisting that it is the governing party, that it has an absolute majority. I mean, that's a problem. So what it meant that the DA had to be, firstly, in government, they had to sow in the portfolios that they perform better than the ANC. Of course, that's quite easy to do.
It's a pretty low bar to get over, isn't it?
Yeah, and then they have to sell that, right, to to the supporters and non-supporters. I think what the DA has gained, it has gained Black supporters, I think, who in the past were fearful or in the past bought into the ANC's white gevaar, wit gevaar, to say, well, actually, the moment a white party takes control of the national government, they will bring a party in. Now, for the first time, they've seen the voters, many of these voters who were fearful and who wanted to get away from the ANC, can now see, well, actually, they are members of the DA, Freedom Front Plus, and so on, in the national government, and they are actually honest, and they're working hard, and they're working in the interest of South Africa, not in their own personal interest, and so on. And I think that psychologically has shifted. So perhaps from a DA point of view, I think they may have picked up a extra percentage of voters, of Black voters, who were ready to leave the ANC but were too fearful to vote for parties that they were told are white, DA, Freedom Front Plus, and so on. Then I think the DA would have lost voters from their right flank to the Freedom Front Plus, ironically, to the, to their partner in the GNU. But I think actually, if I mean, for the DA really to become the majority party, it really needs to get into the flank. Let's call it the Black flank. It needs to get at least Black middle class voters, concentrate, get those people who are ready to vote for another party, but who are still fearful of the wit gevaar. Because, ANC leaders continue to emphasize that. Parties like MK and the EFF, they continue to emphasize that, and so on.
I think, Professor Gumede, that the point you're making, first of all, I agree with your analysis. I think it's a very fair analysis about gaining here and losing there. In the aggregate, probably they'll gain a little bit more potentially, although I'm not totally convinced that yet, but there's a lot of time till before the November elections. But I think the point you're making here is that well, first off, the Black middle class now is larger than the entire white population in South Africa. So that is a very rich vote base. Of the, let's say, 6 million middle-class Blacks out there, let's just make that number, okay? I think that's a fair assessment. 6 million, of that, there's at least 2 million voters in there. That's 2 million people, many of whom don't vote for the DA or other parties now, that could be carved off. Don't let them become apathetic like a lot of these white voters who don't vote. Get out there, get them to vote for your standard, and I think that's a fair assessment. Let me switch to something else that is apropos here. When we talk about blaming others and the ANC being responsible for tribalism or racism, Also, they have this ugly situation amongst segments of South Africa's population, this xenophobic reaction and blaming foreigners. Look, I mean, I made this very clear. No one has a right to be in a country unless they enter there legally and they have the permission of that country. I don't support this borderless nonsense. States are sovereign for a reason, and people should respect their sovereignty. I've lived in 16 countries, and I've been to over 80 for work around the world, and I respect the sovereignty of every country I've lived in, everyone I've visited. I follow the rules and laws, mores, and norms. Everyone should do that. So the 6 or 7 million illegals that are in South Africa need to get out, but they don't need to be burned out or murdered or chased out. The xenophobia that's going on and blaming foreigners, and even in his speech yesterday, President Ramaphosa obliquely blamed foreigners for the problems that the ANC has created, the very problems it created. What about xenophobia in South Africa? This is pretty scary, particularly with this deadline coming up on 30 June, March and Operation Dudela, threatening foreigners. This is pretty scary. I mean, and this goes back a long way, Professor Gumede. One of my favorite South African films is a film called The Long Run, starring one of my favorite actors, Armin Muller-Stahl, who was from East Germany. He played an ethnic German in South Africa. He gets pushed out because he's white from his brick factory, but he was a coach of the ultra marathoners who ran the Comrades, and he winds up being the coach for this Namibian girl, and all the aspects of this. And she was living in a township, and the xenophobes came and attacked all the foreigners. This is from like 2006 or 7, long time. This has been an aspect of South African politics for at least 2 decades. This is playing right into the hands of those who want to divide the country, would be my argument.
Yes. The thing is, if we would, let's just say we chase every African, non-South African African out of the country, it is not going to, it is not going to give us new jobs and new housing and can deal with our corruption and the ANC incompetence and so on. I mean, that is the reality. And, the ANC started off this, the blame game. Once you begin to blame self-inflicted problems on apartheid, on the past, right, when that becomes a bit difficult to, loses a bit of currency, you're looking for other victims, for other people to blame, right? So the foreigners become now a group to blame. My fear is, the next thing is people will start to blame other communities in South Africa for the problem. So instead of taking accountability for failures, for corruption, for the incompetence, for the nonsensical policies that has caused the poverty and the unemployment. And the fact that the ANC, I mean, this policy of cadre deployment where the ANC only appointed its own people to all positions in government and so on, it itself has tribalized South Africa, because what it means, like, if you're not part of that inner circle of the ANC, you feel like an outsider, you feel hopeless, and so on. And then you go into your own community. You say, well, actually, where do I go? You go into your own lager, your own community, whether you're colored or Indian or white or Afrikaner, and so on. That, and it's all because of the ANC's policy of saying we will only look after ourselves. From a color point of view, then from a party point of view, and then from even if you're black and you do not agree with the ANC, you will never ever be appointed to any of government institution, or you'll never get a contract with the state and so on. So what do you do then? You will also go into your own tribal. If you then this is Zulu, you say, well, maybe I'll get, let me just get to my community. Or if you've got a talent, the skills, the capacity, you go abroad. So a lot of our divisions that we are seeing now in the country is to do with the ANC's misgovernance and so on. Sadly, what we've seen in recent times, there's been, there's been extra parliamentary individuals and groups who are weaponizing the migrant issue in order for them to gain power, to get into power. But there's also, sadly, some of our current political parties, our established political parties, they are also using the migrant issue, to gain votes, to get into power. And so on. So instead of actually holding the ANC accountable and looking at our policies that has brought us here, people are looking for the easy way out, scapegoats, and not looking at the reality. It's not facing our realities, and what are our realities? We've been brought here where we are by the ANC to corruption, incompetence, nonsensical policies, and excluding the talent of South Africa.
No, I think that's spot on, Professor Gumede, excluding the talent of South Africa because they're not connected cadres, and it's a recipe for disaster, which is where we're headed. Now, there's a very poignant thing that you wrote here that's in your op-ed. I'm going to read this paragraph, and then I want to relate it to a couple things, and I'm actually going to bring Trump in here, but not really talk about Trump, but just to make a point. Because ANC leaders do not consult with non-ANC individuals, groups, and communities, they are talking to themselves in increasingly narrow echo chambers of their own connected party leaders, cadres, and apparatchiks, mistaking this echo chamber for the voices of all South Africans. Now, what I want to say about that is that the perfect example of this is their foreign policy towards the United States. You know, this argument that they tried to make last year, they make one argument uninformed because they're talking to themselves and not looking outside the tent to see what people are saying and what's really happening. So, for instance, when Trump got angry last year, when Ramaphosa, by the way, violated the law in my view because he signed the expropriation on compensation when he was in Davos, but in fact, he signed it in December and then waited over 30 days so that the parliament, 1/3 of parliament, couldn't oppose it and go to the Constitutional Court, which is what your Constitution says. Nobody's arguing about that. He violated the law, intentionally misleading the public, pretending he hadn't signed it. Anyway, so Trump saw that in expropriation on compensation, and then because of that, Trump started taking measures, including his executive order that came out on the 7th of February, which was a few weeks after that. But not until South Africa's government and its officials insulted America several times before Trump issued that executive order. They're just playing with fire. So they blame Jan van Riebeeck, they blame apartheid, they blame Donald Trump, but America's discord with the South African government predates Trump by 20 years. We've been angry since 2003 when the Rome Statute came into effect and South Africa refused to sign the Article 98 waiver protecting our service members who would go there for joint exercise and things like that, saying that they wouldn't extradite us because we're not a signatory. And that's where it starts. And then it comes with the 75% tariffs on our poultry products, the ban on our pork products. All the while, we give South Africa duty-free access for over 6,000 goods and services to our marketplace, and we give it billions, $8.1 billion to fight HIV, despite Thabo Mbeki's idiotic lunacy about beetroot and Dr. Monto there claiming that poverty is the cause of HIV. We give all this money, we provide all this support, and South Africa's government stabs us in the back, left and right. They talk about an alternate currency to undermine the dollar with the BRICS, and the list goes on, all these affronts. But in the meantime, we've got Cyril Ramaphosa, Gwede Mantashe, Ronald Lamola especially, and Fikile Mbalula running around, running their mouth about America, insulting America, blaming Trump, and not seeing what's actually happening here. And what frustrates me about this is that on the eve of the G20 summit, Ronald Lamola goes on CNN in a documentary which I was part of, but CNN did put me on air because I wouldn't lie for them. But in that documentary, he calls Donald Trump the leader for global white supremacy, essentially the same thing that Ibrahim Rasool did previously, but he does it on CNN, a global broadcast. And then throughout the G20, we see multiple examples of ANC leaders, including Ramaphosa, mocking President Trump. These people live in an echo chamber. Do they not realize that this is the largest economy in the world and can do so much to help South Africa? And the United States is willing to help South Africa. But these constant insults, if it wasn't for Ukraine and Gaza and Iran, I think that South Africa might get a little more attention from the U.S. And it's probably good that Trump is not focused on South Africa because Ramaphosa and his ilk insult America at every turn, and I think they do it to their detriment. Obviously, I come from a biased position there, Professor Gumede. I'm a proud American, but I do think that most of what I said was pretty objective.
You know, the ANC has been anti-American for long before the Trump administration, and I can forward you or viewers many articles, the last 15 years that I've written and opinion pieces and other Black South Africans have written to say, well, actually, if we continue that anti-American wave, the ANC continue that, it will catch up with us at some point. Already about 10 years or so, I mean, even, the Democrats, when they were in charge, they were worried about where the ANC is going, and so on. It's just, the Trump administration is kind of on the back of already, prior to that, concerns in the US about South Africa's anti-Americanism. And the thing is, that the US may be in our second biggest partner. So in technical terms, and maybe many South Africans fully understand this. In technical terms, the US is our second biggest partner. But in real terms, the US is our biggest partner. So, what do I mean by that? I mean, we've got US companies in South Africa. There's been many of them here for a century, localized, providing jobs here, manufacturing companies, and so on, providing over 500,000 jobs. Then what we've got, we've got non-state organizations, providing opportunities and jobs in South Africa. We've got cultural exchanges, we've got technology exchanges, we've got sports exchanges. So if we bring it all together, and if we include also the state-to-state, obviously a lot of that has been cut, and the development aid has been cut. It's extraordinary. If we look then at China, which is supposed to be our biggest trading partner, China does not do, for example, Black economic empowerment or forms of action that US companies would do while they're in South Africa. They don't support democratic institutions. They don't support civil society. Let's just give me an example on, our civil society sector. Let's call it our civil society, social enterprises sector. That's a sector that employs upwards to 1 million jobs. Right? That sector is the majority funding from that sector actually comes from foreign donations and development aid, mostly out of the US and mostly out of Europe. And that sector employs mostly Black South Africans. 2/3 of the employees, there's young Black South Africans. The management of that sector is mostly, Black women, the majority of the managements. That sector is bigger than the construction sector. Now, the Chinese will not make any contribution to that sector because there you have, service delivery NGOs, democracy building NGOs. There's absolutely no way. The Chinese do not do philanthropic or democracy building or service delivery type of support. So again, if we bring, the US is such a critical partner of South Africa. It is actually in real terms our biggest partner. And that is what many ANC leaders, I don't think they understand that because of they're looking through foreign policy through this rigid ideological prism. Outdated, let's call it a Cold War, the West against, the East against the Soviet Union. That's still that's how they look at policy, and the world has moved on.
Yes, Francis Fukuyama famously, of course, he was derided for this, called for the end of history because, but that's not that people took that the wrong way. Unfortunately, I think he was onto something, but the title was bad. But yeah, in the West, we've moved on largely from the Cold War, but the ANC has this mindset. They're still stuck in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and they're not willing to move on from that. It's fascinating that they have this mindset and they just don't want to move on from it. I think it stunts their ability to cooperate with others. And you talk about the U.S. being the major partner. That's the argument I've made all along. The $23 billion a year in two-way trade is an $8 billion surplus for South Africa. Hey, that's pretty good. Whereas the trade with China is a major deficit because they're shipping finished products like Jatour trucks and cars and things to South Africa, while they're importing coal from Richards Bay and they're importing iron and platinum and commodities from South Africa. Not much in the way of finished good. John Steenhuisen can go to China and crow about selling stone fruit there all day long, but that's not going to put a dent in the trade deficit with China. But we'll get to China just a second before we wrap up, because I know you just wrote something on that recently. I want to get to that. One of the viewers asked a question, and I want to touch on it briefly. I don't want to I don't want to encourage the spread of yet more political parties in South Africa, but one of the viewers asked a question a while ago and asked about what are your thoughts about Prince Mashatile's party for all South Africans and the concept. I think we have too many parties in South Africa, but that's just my personal view.
No, it's also my personal view. Too many political parties. I mean, in this local government elections, there's 500 political parties, as I understand. I mean, just, and they all offer the same thing. I think what we need to do really is a consolidation of our political parties. And of course, I'm a bit biased on this sort of thing because, I was the independent chair of the multi-party charter. They brought together the DA, IFB, Freedom From Plus, and so on, 15 political parties ahead of the 2024 elections. And I agreed to do that because I believed that we need to build a consolidated center in South Africa. And rather than splintering up that center. And so on. But I would encourage, everyone who is pro-constitutional, who is non-racial, and who is, pro-market, pro-entrepreneurship, to get into the political space and to, in whatever way they feel is a good thing. But I am biased to say, well, actually, let's all connect together and form a new consensus for South Africa. I mean, we were talking about the ANC's eco chamber and the ANC's consensus, which with the EFF and MK, that's like, there's a consensus out there. It's a populist consensus, which has been running South Africa in the wrong direction and running South Africa into destruction. What we need to do is we need to create a new consensus now that's much more non-racial, that is center, based on conservative family values, and so on, and based on entrepreneurship. And I think that is what we need to do.
Well, now I'm going to put you on the spot. You don't have to answer, but I'm going to put you in the spot. Of course, I was at the multi-party charter as an accredited journalist, courtesy of the UIM, and Neil de Beer inviting me to come there. So I came. I didn't get a chance to interview you because you were quite busy as independent chair, but we did briefly pass and say hello to each other. You probably won't recall, you were quite busy. But I spent my time interviewing Herman Mashaba, Steenhuisen, Neil de Beer, and others at that event. That was interesting. Now, my question to you, to put you on the spot, which you don't have to answer, is that it was all collegial out there in front of the cameras. Was it that collegial in the closed room? Was there, or was it? It's been 2 years. The MPC is gone. So, are you free to speak?
It's a very unfair question. You don't have to answer. I'm saying it's an unfair question, so tell you.
Okay. All right. I've got my answer. Okay. All right. One more question from my audience here, and then I want to switch to China before we wrap up. Okay, because you've got things you've got to do there. So one of the questions was, what does Professor Gumede think of the 145 race-based laws? Before you answer, I'll give my thoughts on that. I think it's asinine. It's racist. I was opposed to affirmative action. I saw the negative consequences of affirmative action in America. It didn't uplift anybody. What you need to do, in my view, is ensure equality of opportunity. And you do that by investing in places that didn't get investment before, like education, in communities, and you level the playing field. That's what government's supposed to do. That's my take, Professor Gumede. Let's hear your view on the 145 race-based laws.
What I would say is, blacks are a majority in South Africa, right? The ANC is a black party in control of the state. So if you're in control of the state, you're in control of the state. You're in control of the annual budget. You're in control of state-owned entities. And South Africa is a heavily state-owned country economy, like more than other economies. This is almost and so on. So the ANC has to have the confidence to say, well, if they're in control of the state, then they should use the levers of the state to deliver services. And because the majority of people are black and the majority of them are poor, when you deliver effectively, the majority will benefit from it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, you're chuckling, and I'm chuckling as well. I have my microphone on mute, so I didn't disturb you there. But yeah, the bottom line is that just perform. That's the end of the day. Just perform. If you want the big contract, we'll give you the big contract to play for Manchester United, but you got to perform on the pitch, and the ANC is not performing on the pitch.
That's it. So I mean, the ANC's focus has been the wrong focus. I mean, they've got a state and they messed it up. With all of the power, economic power, the finances and so on, why didn't they not deliver? I mean, for me, that really is the issue. By getting the economic growth, performing and so on, it will deliver. And as I say, I mean, majority of South Africans are black and majority of them poor. If the government runs effectively, if business runs effectively, they are going to be, the majority will be the major beneficiaries.
Well, Professor Gumede, I want to respect your time, so I'm just going to wrap up here shortly, give you a chance to talk about your other op-ed about China. But I do want to offer you an opportunity to come back at any time you'd like to discuss further things, and I'd like to get your take on something that I'd like to have a profound discussion about this. I argue that South Africa's democracy is an illiberal democracy because you don't vote for representatives, you vote for party list, and therefore parties pick the people who represent you. And we've seen with Cater deployment, you send a Venda down to the Western Cape. They don't speak Xhosa, they're not Khoi, they're not San, they're not Afrikaans, and they don't care because the ANC values one thing over everything else: loyalty to Lutuli House. So I'd love to have that conversation with you sometime and see your thoughts on that. If you want to respond to that now, you're welcome to. But I do want to shift gears to your recent op-ed that came out this week about China. China has offered a 2-year window for duty-free access to almost all African countries. And I think this is a strategic communications tool that they're using to make friends and influence people, particularly at a time, very clever on the part of the Chinese. They struck when the AGOA was being renewed and was delayed. And so it makes them look like the good guys. Look, we're giving duty-free access, ignoring the fact for the past 25 years, the United States has offered duty-free access to any country that agrees to voluntarily abide by the standards we've set for governance, for justice, for poverty alleviation and things like that. So the U.S. is kind of not there right now. AGOA has been renewed, but it's in confusion because all the unilateral the tariffs that Trump has been trying to impose. So there's a lot of confusion around this, and the U.S. doesn't look like the good guys when I would argue we've been very good guys. And South Africa's been the biggest beneficiary of AGOA by far, the major beneficiary. But China now is offering this in a 2-year window, and I think most people don't realize it's just 2 years. And in my view, and I think you're going to agree, that's why I want to get your take on this, I think it's cynical by the Chinese. They're not serious. They're just looking for a public relations win, and they're not honest brokers. That's my take on this.
As I say, I mean, there's zero tariffs. I mean, obviously, there's never anything called zero tariffs. Nothing, and so on. I think just the first thing is the fact that they're only giving it to African countries that supports the one China policy. And so on, that they don't recognize Taiwan. I mean, so that's the first. That's obviously obvious.
But to be fair, that means really just Eswatini can't participate. I think they're the only ones left in Africa.
No, but I'm telling you, there's something else behind it, because they're also saying you don't have to state, you can state one thing to say, well, you follow this, but there's an understated requirement after you say that to say, well, actually, there's also other things. If you get the zero tariffs, if China's in dispute with the US, you're going to have to follow China. Because, for me, that's the understated, they don't have to spell out all of the other things, but they can spell out one thing. And so on, and that's that's the line. And then also, this is a temporary thing. I mean, this is only for 2 years. And I mean, the timing also, the timing is where, the US appeared to be, I mean, on a renegotiation of AGOA and sort of the uncertainty around it, and China's fight for global hegemony with the US, so this is tactical, trying to bring Africa in, but it's also for two things: critical minerals. I mean, there is a global contest for critical minerals in Africa, and that is one way to lock in Africa into China, into China's sphere, but not only for politics, but to try to get the raw materials and to try to get one on the US and so on. And people also forget the countries must still negotiate individually. There may be a zero tariff, but you still have to negotiate. I mean, actually, my opinion piece that you saw was actually my speech that I gave at the Horicro Summit. This is the Sudwest Farmers Association down in Cape Town 2 weeks ago, because farmers now have to negotiate to try to get into the Chinese so-called zero tariff the market, and so on. Now, but people forget that when it is raw materials can get easily into China, but if it's processed materials and your manufacturing goods, that's totally different. So they still have to negotiate. What I worry about is the unstated potential obligation that, well, now China is giving zero tariffs and African countries are accepting it. Does it mean that China can now send its state subsidized manufacturing products that in the South African case and in other African cases displace our local manufacturing, our local jobs, and so on? Is that part of the unstated obligation?
Well, I think that's a fair point to make there, that it's the stuff that's unspoken, supporting, especially when it comes to critical minerals, because that's, people keep talking about the next war is over water. Maybe it might just well be over critical minerals, rare earth elements, which aren't really all that rare. They're just in low concentration. And this may be where the next big conflict is, critical minerals, because while the world slept, China was clever for the last 30 years and bought up every mine around the planet. The United States closed down our Mountain Home rare earth element mine out in California. We had no production just a few years ago. We finally woke up to the strategic vulnerability that we face in this environment. I mean, we have other strategic vulnerabilities. Many of the microprocessors that power our stealth fighters and our missiles come from Taiwan. So, or Japan. We've made ourselves vulnerable there. We may have the world's best AI chips and the best video cards made in America, but we've got vulnerabilities. So, Professor Gumede, I really want to thank you for coming on today. It was a pleasure talking about this.
Let me just stop you if you still have a minute. So,
I've got time. Go ahead.
On the parties you were saying in terms of our electoral system. I mean, there is a flaw in our electoral system. Really, it favors political parties, and we've got a closed list system, meaning that the political parties choose their candidates. The voters have absolutely no power to choose their candidates and also to choose the president, because parliaments choose the president and the parties, nominate and so on. And, there is a window of opportunity because but people often forget that in 1994, when the constitutional frame was put together, our interim constitution, the obligation was to change the electoral system into the democracy. Now, the ANC was always unwilling to do that because the system favors them. The current system favors them because the ANC leaders can handpick candidates, flawed candidates that are only loyal to the party, not loyal to the country or the country's interests. And if they sleep in parliament, if they're corrupt and incompetent, ordinary citizens can't recall them, and so the system works. But the Constitutional Court, a couple of years ago, did say that we have to review the electoral system, and maybe for ordinary citizens must get involved in this review. We need to change our electoral system to make our elected representatives much more accountable and to allow ordinary citizens and constituencies to directly vote their parliamentarians in.
Well, 100%, and thank you for delving into that. The argument I've been making for a long time is it's an illiberal democracy because you have no say. Nobody voted for Nelson Mandela to be president, although he probably would have won overwhelmingly if people had the direct vote. But nobody voted for him. Nobody picked Zuma. That was Parliament. That was the ANC. That's who picked Zuma. And so this is a problem. But the problem gets manifest in so many other ways, Professor Gumede, which I know you're aware of. I mean, I think it's absolutely ludicrous that America can be ousted in Nelson Mandela Bay because of a parliamentary system at the local level. It's one thing at the national level, but at the provincial level, but to bring it all the way down to local level, what we have is fractious governments at the local level, and it can fall, and you get an Al Jumaya candidate who becomes the mayor of Johannesburg despite having one seat for that party. Talk about a skew. Nobody voted for those clowns. I mean, one seat, and he only got that through proportional representation, if I recall correctly, because they got 0.7% of the vote. That's absolutely insane. No one can govern a country like that, and the outcomes are obvious. Look, whether they like him or dislike him, and whether you like that he went to Action SA, not germane. But an objective observer would say that the government under Athol Trollip, when they ran Nelson Mandela Bay, cleaned up that town as best they could in the short period that they were in charge of that, and turn that city around. I've talked to black and colored and white South Africans who live in Nelson Mandela Bay, and they say when he was the mayor, overnight, things changed. We had service delivery that started working. People were being held accountable. And then the EFF defected and the whole thing fell apart. You can't govern a country like that. It's insane. It's one thing at the national level, but as I said, all politics are local, and local services, if they aren't delivered, they'll never be delivered if you've got the mess we have in Joburg right now. This is insane. You must have this reform.
No, absolutely. I mean, at a local level, particularly, what we need to do is, to have, not to allow these, small parties to be able to bring down local governments. So I was part of, or I co-chaired in 2024 before a national elections, an inquiry that looks at proposals on how we can make this sort of thing much more equitable and much more democratic, and so on. And among the recommendations that we made at the time, and which it was then the ANC was in charge, was that look, we must bring in at least some kind of percentage. Will say, well, in order to get into a local government, let's have a ceiling. If you get 5% or something like that, we have to put some numbers there to make it impossible for that sort of gerrymandering to happen at a local level. Otherwise, we're going to have instability going on forever.
Well, the German Bundestag, of course, has a 5% threshold. It's a lesson they learned from the 1930s when the Nazis and National Socialists were able to take over the government, just 1/3 of the vote, and look what happened there. So in the Federal Republic of Germany, the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, after the dispensation at the end of the Second World War, in their Grundgesetz, their constitution, they set up that only 5% representation. If you don't get 5% of the vote, you don't get represented in parliament. I don't know if that'll work on a national level for South Africa, but at the local level, I agree. It's needed.
No, absolutely. At a local level, at least we have to do that.
Yep. All right. Well, Professor Gumede, as I said, it's a distinct pleasure to have you on. I really appreciate it. You are welcome back anytime. Anything you want to discuss, just let me know. If you want to come back on the program when I get back to South Africa next time, I'd love to have a coffee with you. I don't know if you drink coffee. If not, we can have a rooibos tea.
I absolutely love coffee. I have a cappuccino person.
Okay. Well, the only place I drink cappuccinos is in South Africa. I was in France for the Rugby World Cup in 2023, and you would think the French would know how to make coffee. Their cappuccinos suck. They're worse than American cappuccinos. It was horrible. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I mean, a cappuccino is mostly milk and sugar, and I'm all up for sugar. So,
okay, thank you. God bless you.
All right. Likewise, Professor William Gumede. Folks, I'll let him drop off there. Of course, Professor Gumede is the founder of the Democracy Works Foundation. Looks like he didn't quite find his way out there. Let me help him out. He found it just as I got there. The founder of the Democracy Works Foundation and the author of the best-selling book, Restless Nation, Making Sense of Troubled Times, published by Tafelberg. There's a link to his website. You can find the book if you want below this video. I want to thank my guests for being here. I found this to be a very intellectually stimulating conversation. I hope you felt the same way. You'll be redirected to the news, which is the top of the hour in less than 1 minute, but I'm going to have to take a second to stretch my legs, and we'll be up in just a couple minutes with the news. Don't worry, I got to get to the news quickly because I have to run off to go to the pharmacy, which is a half hour away, then come back for 2 dental appointments. All right, guys, news is coming up in just a moment. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Professor Gumede. Appreciate it, and I thank everyone for being here. Be sure to hit that like button if you haven't done already. Costs you nothing but a moment of your time. Cheers, everybody.